All right, so if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, Dr. Lillard, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Colleen Lillard. I'm a clinical psychologist, WVU medicine, behavior medicine, and psychiatry. I'm also the statewide forensic clinical director with the Department of Health Facilities. And my favorite ice cream is chocolate chip cookie dough. And today I'm going to see if I can share my screen. I'm going to talk about adolescent brain development, just adolescent development in general, and kind of how it overlaps with adolescent decision making. So give me one moment. You guys need me to swap, right? Are you seeing just a good screen? All right, I got a thumbs up from Kelly and a nod from Amanda. All right. So I have a lot of slides here today. I would love if people would stop and ask questions. Some of this gets into the brain and areas of the brain, which gets really complicated. My goal is not to give everybody a science lesson today, but rather to kind of talk about, practically speaking, if certain areas of the brain, how does it relate to the behavior of adolescents? I also have some slides. As a forensic psychologist, I, in the past and now kind of oversee forensic evaluations of adults and juveniles. And so I have some information about what we now know about adolescent brain development, particularly cognitive neuroscience research, has started to infiltrate the courts and how that plays into how courts make decisions about adolescent offenders. So I do have some information about adolescent offenders. And if we have some extra time, this lecture was kind of put together to talk a little bit about trauma and offending. So that's there if we have time to talk about it. Do we have any cases, Kelly? Okay, no case today. But if this brings up any questions or any cases for people, I would love to talk about how you see it in your everyday practice. I'm not good with the chat. Awesome. Thanks for joining us today, Jessica. Let's get started on adolescent brain development. So let's start with, how do we define adolescence? Anybody want to take a shot and define the term adolescence for me? Okay, we're gonna have a quiet group. That's okay. Oh, the chat keeps popping for me. Hold on one second.
I think you have everybody thinking about ice cream now, and
no, it's hard.
Would it be like pre-pubescent stage or post?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're looking to define it by puberty, and that's exactly right. So if I can get my slides to go. So adolescence is it's a developmental period that begins at the start of puberty and then stretches into what we're now thinking about as the mid-20s. The kind of difficulty with defining adolescence is that the end period is very culturally defined. And so, what might have been the end of adolescence 100 years ago has really shifted, and we now have terms like early adulthood, emerging adulthood. We're kind of, as we get better with our research and we get kind of better brain research in particular, we're finding that the brains aren't fully developed until the mid-20s, and that some people would actually consider this kind of period of late adolescence, early adulthood is stretching all the way into those mid-20s. But yeah, we're thinking about it starting at puberty, which is beginning earlier and earlier in kids. So it's making the range of adolescence a little bit longer. And so the idea of this developmental period is present across all cultures and species, but again, that kind of endpoint is more culturally defined. So here are some of the kind of differentiation. And again, lots of research is going to look at this differently. Cultures are going to examine this differently. When we're talking about juveniles in relation to the court process, we are often broadly looking at the ages of 13 to 17. And you can see this is consistent with the code and the laws that we have in West Virginia around competency to stand trial. For example, with juveniles, we state that a juvenile is presumed to be competent beginning at age 13, and then if the attorneys have any reason to think the juvenile is actually not competent, we do an evaluation. But they state that anybody under the age of 13 is not going to be presumed to be incompetent because they haven't hit adolescence, and so we are looking at their culpability differently. So broadly speaking, with the courts, 13 to 17 for juveniles. And then research likes to break it down a little bit more to look at early adolescence, 10 to 13. Again, puberty shifting. There are girls going through puberty at age 10. Then we have middle adolescence, ages 14 to 17. Late adolescence is actually what sometimes was referred to and legally is referred to as adulthood, right? Late adolescence being 18 to 21. And there's this new phase that research is looking at as young adults, and that's 22 to 25. So before we really get into the brain and functioning of adolescence, I want to talk about some of the tasks that occur in adolescence. What are some things that adolescents learn, go through, behaviors they engage in that are kind of hallmarks of this time period in their life? And the three that we're going to talk about today are novelty-seeking behaviors, sensation-seeking behaviors, and risk-taking behaviors. So the first here is novelty-seeking behaviors. This has been defined as the propensity to approach novel and varied experiences. And so what this period of adolescence, one of the defining hallmarks of adolescence is that these are individuals, as they're getting older, they're beginning to seek out novelty or new stimuli, new events, new people as a way to kind of gain new experiences. And there's, although oftentimes when we talk about adolescent development, we're actually talking about like problems with development or areas of concern, and novelty seeking can be viewed kind of negatively. However, it doesn't have to be. It's actually believed that this increase in novelty-seeking behavior supports the gaining of skills, the gaining of experiences that helps youth or adolescents strengthen emotion regulation in adulthood, which, biologically speaking, enhances their likelihood of survival, right? If we think of adolescence as this kind of safe period to explore their environment and to explore new adventures and new experiences, to learn skills with the safety of family and friends and teachers, it allows us to then be able to take those skills and use them independently in adulthood. Another hallmark of adolescence is the increase in sensation-seeking behaviors. Again, something that I think gets construed negatively oftentimes in conversations. However, it doesn't have to be a negative process. It's actually viewed in the literature as primarily adaptive process that is crucial for gaining skills that support independent trajectories in adulthood. So similar to novelty seeking, sensation seeking is pursuit of thrills and adventure and experiences. So novelty means that these are new things. Sensation seeking is kind of that thrill, the adventure, and kind of helping that youth get out there more and try new things. And what comes along with sensation seeking and can get youth into trouble is kind of levels of disinhibition and susceptibility to boredom. So when adolescents are bored, they may be more likely to engage in sensation seeking behaviors, which may get into risk taking behaviors, which we'll talk about next. This last one is that one hallmark of adolescence, again, because it's this period where they get to experience new things and in a semi-safe environment of adults still helping them and watching them, is risk-taking behaviors. And so this is the idea that high perceived reward values is a risk-taking behavior is defined as a high perceived reward value, but known potential negative consequences, which are undervalued to pursue thrills. So these are behaviors in which they could have a big reward or big payoff, but we know that there are negative consequences to it. And so we undervalue the negative consequences. We overvalue the reward that we're going to get in order to pursue these thrills. And the reward could be social. It could be monetary. It could be just kind of that thrill seeking. But again, risk taking means that we know that there's a potential that the person knows the potential negative consequence, but undervalues it just because of the high perceived reward. And so adolescents have a heightened sensitivity to these potential rewards, as well as a sensitivity to peer influence, which makes them vulnerable to this risk-taking behavior. There's actually more and more research coming out that's looking, what we'll talk about today are kind of these big, broad overview of findings about adolescent brain development. But now the research is getting more, it's kind of being fine-tuned to look at individual differences in this. And so we're finding that there are some people who have more sensitivity to peer influence than other people. And we can look at different areas of the brain and how that influences the decisions that they make. And so it's not just that all adolescents are sensitive to peer influence, but it's that even among all adolescents, their level of sensitivity to peer influence is going to differ. And the same thing with heightened sensitivity to potential rewards. There's going to be individual variance or difference within different people, individuals, and adolescents. But in adolescence, there's a relationship between this newly gained ability to plan and make decisions similar to adults. So we do know that they can make these decisions, but it's in the context of still immature impulse control and heightened sensitivity to rewards. And we'll get into this dual system model that kind of gets into that in a little bit. Risk-taking behaviors can be things including extreme sports, substance abuse, and then all the way on one end of a continuum, criminal or unlawful behavior. So this was a quote I liked about the tasks of adolescence. And it says that the major developmental tasks of adolescence includes the establishment and nurturing of intimate relationships, as well as the development of identity, future perspectives, independence, self-confidence, self-control, and social skills. So that's a huge task for these youth, well, age 10 to 22, 25 to go through. And so especially when we're talking about the courts, why is this important? Why do we care that adolescents have to go through all these phases? Why do we care that adolescents' brains look different than adults' brains? And the main reason that the court cares about it is because it raises the questions of adolescents' culpability. So culpability is kind of the amount of blameworthiness for the adolescent. And so the idea being, how much blame do we give them for an illegal or criminal behavior? And because we're saying now that their brains are not the same as adults, then the courts have somewhat shifted to understand that that means that they're not as blameworthy as an adult, even for the same behaviors. And we'll talk about why that might be and what the courts specifically have said and how they've used that cognitive neuroscience and adolescent brain development in making rulings about how we should, what crimes and what punishments adolescents should face. This gets really heavy into a lot of the science of the brain. I'm going to gloss over it as much as I can and just give the caveat that I'm not a neurologist or a neuropsychologist, and the brain is not my specialty area, but we'll get through it together. Okay, so neurons. If we go all the way back to science class, picture here of the neuron. These are functional cells in the brain that send and receive electrochemical signals, which are called action potentials, throughout the brain for information processing. These action potentials are projected by way of the axon that extend from the cell bodies of neurons. These electrical signals are transmitted chemically from one neuron to another across a synapse, way down here. The synapse is that kind of connecting point between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron. Dendrites being, if we've got our nucleus cell body here, we've got our dendrites here, we've got our axon terminals down here. The synapse is going to connect those two. It's a little space in between. And this is where neurotransmitters, they get sent between the two. And those are things like dopamine, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So neurons are formed at birth, and they persist without replacement. However, the ways in which they connect in the brain, that changes over time, especially through adolescence. So interestingly, 95% of the typical brain weight of an adult is in place between the ages of 7 and 11. So physical weight and mass of a brain is almost fully developed between the ages of 7 and 11. However, what the brain then does in adolescence is it begins specializing. It begins optimizing and adapting to specific environmental demands. We'll get into that more in a minute. So the first thing to talk about is kind of gray matter and white matter and how those change in adolescence. So gray matter consists of cell bodies, unmyelinated axons of neurons, dendrites, glial cells, and capillaries. Not that we need to know all those and remember all those. We'll get to these slides so you can refer to them back if you need them. This is the outer layer of our brain. It's involved in processing and cognition. And, you know, throughout, interestingly with the gray matter, we actually see synaptic pruning, which means that all these synaptic connections that have been made, the ones that are used frequently are maintained and stay in the brain. And those connections that haven't been made or haven't been made as frequently start to disappear or be pruned, kind of like you would prune a rose bush, for example. And so we call this synaptic pruning. It's a process that supports brain specialization in response to environmental demands, which means that the more connections that an adolescent is making, all those novelty-seeking adventures and experiences, give them more connections to remain, and the ones that they're not using will eventually disappear. This can enhance computational capacity, speed of information processing, things that can be more complex neural processing as the adolescent gets older. That's going to support reasoning and decision making, but it leads to reduced thickness over adolescence and into adulthood. So we'll see that gray matter is actually going to reduce in thickness between adolescence and adulthood, as opposed to white matter. So white matter is composed of myelinated or insulated axons of neuronal cells and glial cells. This coordinates communication between different areas of the brain, different regions of the brain. And so the big focus in adolescence in white matter is myelination, is this kind of insulation of axons. And it involves the thickening of the insulation of white matter tracts and increases the speed of transmission of neural processes. And so it talks about different areas of the brain will myelinate or become insulated at different periods of time. And so the visual cortex actually becomes that myelinated or insulated in the first 10 years of life. So our visual processes are kind of done at the end of late childhood. But our prefrontal cortex, our decision-making area of the brain, actually continues to myelinate through the 20s. So that's where we talk about adolescents' brains aren't fully developed until they're in their mid-20s. And actually, there's some research to say myelination occurs earlier in females than in males, which I think we see in behavior and decision-making in adolescence, as girls may be maturing a little bit more quickly than boys. Okay, questions? That's a lot. And after we get through all the pieces, we'll talk about what that actually means in terms of behavior. So those talk about kind of structures. There's also neurochemical changes that are happening in adolescence. And one of them, we'll focus on just one of them today. And that's this idea of dopamine. And dopamine availability actually increases through the adolescent period before stabilizing kind of in early adulthood. And why is dopamine important? Well, dopamine underlies motivation. It's really important. It's really important in learning and memory, cognition, emotion, and the big one is reward processing. Sometimes you'll hear now that kind of chasing a dopamine high or a dopamine rush. It's this idea of, it's the reward pathway of our brain. And so we can get kind of stuck on doing anything to get a dopamine rush to kind of get that reward. And so there's increased dopamine transmission in the prefrontal cortex, again, that thinking part, the kind of higher level thinking, executive functioning skills in the brain during adolescence. It makes teenagers really amenable to learning and reward-driven feedback. So reinforcement, they're eager to learn, they're eager to get those rewards because there's increased dopamine transmission. And what this to me as a forensic psychologist is so important is this means that in general, the period of adolescence is a time where people are very, very highly amenable to treatment and rehabilitation strategies. And so this kind of gives us a reason why we say to the courts, this is a time, if we get really good treatment for this youth, he may not or she may not engage in criminal or antisocial behavior in the future. And I've mentioned this phrase a bunch, but our prefrontal cortex is another area of development through adolescence and into early adulthood. Again, kind of mid to late 20s is the full development of the prefrontal cortex. This is an area of the brain that is involved in the process of delaying and reflecting. And so as the prefrontal cortex is slow to develop, that means that young adolescents are going to have less of this ability compared to older adolescents or adults. And so they have less ability to hold off, pause, reflect before making decisions. So this is where impulsivity comes into play. This lack of development limits the time a juvenile will think before they act on a behavior. This also is the area of the brain that helps people think about all of their options. This is problem solving, right? When we think about problem solving, we want to brainstorm all of our options and then weigh each one of them, positive, negative, to figure out which is the best decision to make. That comes from the development of the prefrontal cortex, which takes a long time through adolescence, meaning they're impulsive. And this is also the part of our brain that helps us contemplate risks and consequences. And so we have the sensation seeking, because again, remember, they are downplaying those potential consequences, undervaluing the potential consequences in order to get the reward, because they've got increased dopamine and their prefrontal cortex hasn't given them the ability to really contemplate those risks or consequences. And then another piece of the prefrontal cortex is this idea of social intelligence. And so social intelligence and social processing is the idea of taking other people's thoughts and understanding what another person might be thinking or feeling, or being able to process a person's facial reactions, which makes it difficult for adolescents to sometimes be empathetic towards others. And this kind of increases their susceptibility to peer pressure. And so what do all of these kind of developmental changes in the brain of an adolescent, what does it look like for all of us that are working with youth day in and day out? Well, we talk about it having a dual systems model. And these systems are one is a social emotional system and the other is the cognitive control system. And the idea with the dual systems model, and there's a couple other now similar models, because this is a bit simplistic for what actually maybe occurs for all youth. But in general, the dual systems model says that it's an imbalance hypothesis. It's the idea that there's gradual maturing of self-regulation. That's our cognitive control, right? So that is, we slowly gain self-regulation skills as we age. However, that is outpaced by rapid developments in sensation seeking, particularly in the first half of adolescence. And so, as we'll talk about in the end, this means that if we're using an analogy of a car, youth have full pedal to the metal on the gas, but their brake system is not currently fully in place. So they're go, 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 and sensation seeking and reward seeking and risk taking, but their ability to self-regulate and control their cognitions is delayed in processing. So let's look at those two systems. Let's first talk about the social emotional system, because that one is going to develop first and develop fast. And this begins in the limbic midbrain and the orbital frontal areas of the frontal lobe. And it's developing faster than the cognitive control. This controls the emotional kind of state of the brain. This is shown in increased need for rewards, increased sensation seeking, more reactive emotional responses to both positive and negative emotions, and increased attentiveness to social cues. So adolescents become increasingly socially oriented to their peers and show greater sensitivity to the presence of peers and the evaluation of peers. So they're worrying about what peers think about them. And they're kind of sensitive to when other people around, how they act and behave. This is the emotional, affective, and reward context of adolescent. It has an impact on decision making. A little bit more information here. That social emotional cognition, increased socialization. This is kind of, we know that adolescence is a time of increased socialization with peers, potential romantic partners, particularly over family. And the social processing is a complex system, includes processing facial reactions of other people. Theory of mind is being able to take the perspective of another person or to recognize and understand the emotions another person may be feeling. Emotional processing of their own emotions as well, and then social reasoning. So adolescents tend to struggle to understand the intentions of others and to process rejections. And in the presence of peers, adolescents develop greater risk-taking than adults do. And peer approval activates regions involved in action more so than in adolescence. Peer approval activates regions involved in action more than it does in children or adults. And it's been found that adolescents are more reactive to threat cues because these limbic regions show greater activation in emotional stimuli. This plays into the role of making kind of irrational decisions that adolescents may make, particularly in situations that have more emotional context, and we'll talk about those in a bit. So that is happening rapidly in adolescence. And what is happening slowly is this cognitive control. This is the dorsolateral area of the frontal lobe. And it provides a check to the social emotional control system, but not until it's fully developed, right? When this system is matured, there's increased impulse control. There's better emotion regulation. There's more foresight and detection of different types of options, better problem solving, better planning, anticipation of different outcomes, and greater resistance to stress and peer pressure. All of these are wonderful things and are great when we have both the systems crossing each other, but it's the slowness of the cognitive control system that causes issues for adolescents.
I have a quick question, Colleen.
Go for it.
Obviously, there's some variation among adolescents who appear to have like more or less of these cognitive controls. Like, is that a brain development variation? What accounts for the variation, would you say?
So I think that's where the research is really kind of new, and the new studies are showing that there are individual differences, and it kind of depends on what they're looking at. I know I was looking at a study that looked at kind of susceptibility to peer influence, and that those individual differences will then affect sensation-seeking behaviors. There's also a really cool paper that I'll send to Kelly to send out to everybody, but it looked at how particular alcohol, tobacco, and substance use impacted the development of the adolescent brain. And it was able to show what areas were increased and decreased, and how, you know, that particular period of time is, with all that growth, how giving these substances would actually kind of alter the trajectory for youth. I think that genetics, of course, is going to play a role. Environmental factors. There's some data that talks about how kind of trauma can get in the way of these processes. So this is kind of like your average adolescent big picture, but I think we have a lot more to learn when it comes to what the actual individual differences would be.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. One area of individual difference, or even just differences in how adolescents make decisions is has to do with the context. And we talk about this as either cold cognition or hot cognition. So cold cognition is adolescent decision making in a calm environment. When they're given the time and the tools to make a well thought out decision, given time to consider all the input, adolescents have the ability to make logical and reasoned thinking. And so I kind of think about this as maybe if they were problem solving an issue in their therapist's office, where the therapist could help them with the problem solving, go through the steps of brainstorming. Okay, let's take each option and let's weigh the pros and the cons of every one of them to think out that decision slowly. That's cold cognition. And adolescents are pretty good at that. Where adolescents get into trouble is hot cognition situations. These are situations where they're under stress, they're emotionally kind of reactive or emotionally charged situations. These are heat of the moment situations. There are situations where there's like this immediacy in having to make a decision, or there's high emotional arousal. Emotionally influenced thinking leads to more impulsive risk-taking and influence of others. So if we're looking at two different situations, an adolescent is going to struggle more in that hot cognition situation because they're more likely to be impulsive, to undervalue the consequences and overvalue the reward. That's what risk-taking means, right? And they're more susceptible to peer pressure then. They're more influenced by those around them in those emotionally charged situations. And so, you know, that kind of makes us think of, you know, when should we help a youth process or problem solve an issue? It's probably not when they're under stress and that heat of the moment. All right, I was just checking our chat there. 1 second. And so how do we know that all this is true? How do we know that these different areas take more time to develop and that the social emotional goes faster and the cognitive control comes slower? We see it. We see it in longitudinal data. We know that impulsivity in general declines with age. We know that sensation-seeking behaviors decline with age. We know susceptibility to peer influence is going to decline with age. We know time spent problem solving is actually going to increase with age. And we know that people can delay gratification. They can wait till they get that reward more often the older that they get. So it kind of gives us the evidence. So quote that I liked about adolescent risk-taking. The reason is presumably that at this age, the benefit of risky behavior, the social approbation of peers, is rated much more highly than the risk itself. This may be associated with the non-linear maturation pattern of the prefrontal and limbic brain areas. Remember, prefrontal is your cognitive control, limbic areas is your social emotional processing. In accordance with this model, research on preventative programs has shown that programs based on imparting knowledge about risk are less effective than those focusing on individual benefits and on training of social competence and resistance. So is there any school programs that were super huge in the 90s and early 2000s that kind of fits this? Programs based on imparting knowledge of risks that we now know are just not effective. What does this make you think of? I bet Dr. Husted went through this program. I went through this program.
I'm thinking dare.
Yes, Anna, that is it. Exactly. That's what comes to my mind. We know that DARE didn't work. We know it actually probably made things a little bit worse and made drugs really enticing to some kids. And I think this explains why. The point of DARE was to impart knowledge about all the risks of drug use, but that's not as effective. Rather, we could have focused on youth's individual benefits. We could have trained social competence and resistance to peer pressure as a way that is probably more likely to make positive changes in risk-taking behavior long-term. Okay, I'm going to pause there for questions. I know there's a couple people from the court here. If you'd like some more information about landmarks, so really important cases of how we treat juveniles, we can talk about that. But I'm going to stop sharing and open it up for questions.
If you don't mind, can I start with a question?
Of course.
So I'm sure you saw where there was a bunch of like threats in like Preston and Mon County and surrounding counties. So how do you think the juvenile will be charged that was caught making the threats? Do you think that they'd be tried as an adult, or?
That's a great question. I'm not sure about the trying as an adult. I think that because of the circumstances nationwide, we have zero tolerance when it comes to school threats and school violence. And so my guess is that there's going to be pretty significant, somewhat maybe harsh consequences for that youth. I think when we look into the brain development, I think the idea of kind of the reward of positive press, of kind of notoriety, there's kind of like this excitement, and the internet, I think, plays into this, that kind of plays into why they downplay the risk or the consequences of making these threats. One, because I think that we know that a youth that is likely to carry out a school shooting probably isn't going to call up and say, hey, I'm going to shoot up the school on Tuesday at 5 o'clock. And so there seems to be another reason why, or another, like, what is influencing their behavior? Why are they kind of putting that out there for everyone to see? Well, that's a good question. They may be charged as adults. It'll be interesting to see. I think the one in Northern Panhandle was charged with terroristic threats. I could be wrong though.
So Dr. Lillard, whenever I worked at the Rubenstein Center,
Oh, I've been there once.
yeah, and we would get kiddos, that would have terroristic acts. They would get juvie life typical.
Oh,
Which is until 21, so not being charged as an adult, but each case obviously is different. But that's what they did with a couple of those kiddos who did like bomb threats, that type of thing, was juvie life.
interesting. And interesting that you were seeing them at Rubenstein Center. For those that kind of are less familiar with the juvenile system in West Virginia, the Rubenstein Center, at least this was way back in like 2011, 2013, or 2012 when I was there, but that was for youth who are well behaved and could kind of work their way through a program, right, with extra privileges.
Correct. And these kids were well behaved. Actually, one of them's been in the military now and he did a tour in Iraq. He's been in there, well, he re-enlisted, so he's been in there close to 4 to 5 years. So, I mean, they did have excellent behavior, but we had them there a couple of years, and actually they may have only had like one infraction the whole time they were there.
Yeah, which to me suggests this amenability to treatment, right? In the right environment with the right support system, we can get them back on track. They can live productive pro-social lives. And I think that's, juvenile life sounds terrible, and it's awful to kind of put them away for that period of time, but maybe that kind of structure and system was helpful to those youth.
And I tell you, I think it really messed with him mentally, though, because he spent most of his childhood in detention. And so when he got over to Iraq, he really struggled with his mental health. Because, and he referred to it as it was whenever a juvenile's locked up for a long time, they call it something.
Institutionalized.
Yes, that's it. Thank you. He really thought, mentally that was why he was struggling with depression and anxiety while he was over there.
That's interesting. That is interesting thought. Also, probably, well, the military was structured. There is probably a lot more independence that he got pretty quickly when he went over into the military. Jackie had a question in the chat. She asked, how is early puberty affecting adolescent brain development? That's a great question that I'm not sure I have an answer to. My guess is that it would start the social, emotional, that kind of sensation seeking quicker, whereas the cognitive control is still not, it's still going to mature at the same rate that it was before. And so we might have longer periods of time where this adolescent has the gas to the floor and not have the brake. So rather than it being 13, 14, 15 that puberty is starting, if it's starting at 10, now you've got 10 to 20 or 10 to 17 where they're really struggling with impulse control and risk-taking behaviors. But that's total speculation on my part. Maybe it'll get more mature faster, but I doubt that's going to happen. Any other thoughts?
Does anybody else have any other questions? All right, so thank you so much, Dr. Lillard, for such a important and informative lecture. I know it's a good reminder for all of us of just learning all new information. Wanted to do a quick reminder for everyone. Our next session will be October 16th, and we will be talking about the Urgent Family Care Coordinator Model with Anna Butcher. So we'll be excited for that and hopefully see everyone. So if no one has any other questions. Oh.
Actually, Amanda Newhouse will be doing that presentation because I have court.
Okay,
Oh,
thank you. We
hopefully
look
Amanda
forward
will
to that.
talk up all of Anna's excellent qualities and everything she's been able to accomplish very well. Thanks, everyone. Have a great Wednesday, is it?
Yes.
Thanks, Colleen. That was great.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you all.